My name is Caroline Hyde. I've got the joy to join you here from Bloomberg Television. And I'm going to be introducing a fabulous panel because we've just heard from some fascinating reports coming from the OECD, of course, that we are in a low-growth trap, that monetary policy is doing all the heavy lifting. Where is government policy? Well, we're very pleased to say we're going to have a panel with ministers, with decision makers, with those who are advising the decision makers, and to really discuss what policies are needed to be enacted and perhaps are already seeing the initial fruits of their labour. I will just take my place, then I'll invite my panel up to the stage. Please do give a warm welcome. So if I could join me to my right first, if the first member of the panel could please come up and join. It is Rodrigo Valdez. He, of course, is Minister of Finance for Chile. Come and take a seat up to my right. Then will be Jason Furman, President of the Council of Economy Advisors for the US. And then, so thank you very much, Mr. Valdez. Mr. Furman. And then lastly, on the right, is going to be Pravin Gordhan, Minister of Finance for South Africa. Then, on to my left, I will have Mehmet Simsek, if he could join us. He, of course, is the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey. Then next will be Li Wei, DRC President of China. Of course, the Development Research Council. Thank you very much indeed. And then Lilian Ploumen. Thank you very much, Minister of Foreign Trade and Development for the Netherlands. Please do give a warm welcome to our panelists. So I'm going to put a quick and punchy question to each of you and ask you whether you would agree or disagree, and how you can elaborate. A low-growth trap. I will start with you, Mr. Valdez. Are we indeed in a low-growth trap? Are we going to see flatlining of growth this year? And are there risks to the upside or to the downside?
Well, thank you. Good morning to everybody. We have plenty of risks, but let me go first to the baseline, that I think it's not good enough, so we can focus on the baseline first, which is, as you mentioned, low growth. Some others have talked about secular stagnation. Others have talked about the new mediocrity in the world economy, which is true. We're growing less than what we were used to. What are, to me, critical aspects of this poor baseline? First, I think there are crisis legacies still not fully addressed, and some policy mistakes in the last 8 years that I think we have to recognize to understand where we are. When I look at the recovery of the US from the crisis, and when I look at the recovery of Europe from the crisis, it's very difficult not to conclude that policies were different and mattered. And I think we need to take some implications from that. There's also the emerging markets part, where we also have a rotation of growth from a commodity boom cycle that is over, and many emerging markets suffering this, some going even into recession. But here you also have policy slippages. What you did during the boom years, already done, but some overspent. And in these days, you have to really adapt to these new conditions, and some countries have some difficulties on this. Third is the direct effect of uncertainty. Here, I think policymakers, we can do a lot on this. Protectionism is the first minimum that we have to defend. And there's this issue that President Bachelet mentioned, that is this sense of uneasiness by citizens. I would say the backlash against elites that needs a lot of care, because this could drive into populism very easily. We have seen some declarations around the world very close to being populist. And finally is this productivity. And here I want to mention one thing that to me matters a lot. One thing is capital deepening, that we invest more, the story that capital matters. Of course, that's a bit trivial. But I'm more worried about total factor productivity, about multi-factor productivity. And why worries me more that? Because that has a lot of spillovers around the world. If if countries that are at the frontier stop making progress, countries that are inside the frontier will have a much more difficult time. So I think tackling what is behind this lower productivity growth in terms of new ideas, of innovation, I think is critical to move the world economy forward.
Thank you. I'm going to ensure everyone has a microphone just so that you can all interrupt one another, ensure that you can all take pearls of wisdom. I think we're down by one. Does everyone? We're having to be doing a bit of sharing, I think. Nevertheless, we will move swiftly on because I saw Pravin Gordon nodding to many of the things that were being said there, of course, by Rodrigo Valdez of Chile. In particular, perhaps some of the backlash against leaders. Give us a sense of what is foremost on your viewpoint at the moment. Are we facing upside risks, downside risks? What did you take in particular from the discussion from the OECD?
Well, it depends whether you see the world half full or half empty. And as a South African, we have to see it as half full, because that's the optimism that's going to be required that will give us a sense of imagination about what we need to do. But I think beyond just the risks, we need to bring in a few other factors, which Mr. Valdez is beginning to do. First is geopolitics and the kind of impact that it is also having on investment in different parts of the world, instability in different parts of the world, and creating a climate of global uncertainty. The second element is each of our countries or regions will have political dimensions. In other words, apart from just looking at economic risk factors, the political economy of each situation needs to be looked at carefully as well. There are many leaders here in government, and I know the premise that we're starting on is that the markets won't rectify the current situation, policymakers must, but policymakers work within political economic constraints and possibilities as well. And how these factors play out in each environment and how they manage has a crucial determination as to whether you have the space to reform or not in the specific environment in which one finds ourselves. The other factor is the one that has also been mentioned, which is, again, let's call it a soft factor. Some are calling it deglobalization. So you have stagnation and secular stagnation and so on as an economic diagnostic. But there's also the inverted commas deglobalization factor. In other words, focus on the nation state and the dynamics within a national environment, and sometimes the protective policies which are antithetical to promoting growth on a more global basis, and the general shift towards a kind of populist political culture, which doesn't help. But the last point is perhaps in the face of these risks, if you take 2007 to 2009 as an example, the world was able to A, respond quickly, B, offer itself the right kind of political leadership, and C, act in a coordinated way. Now, the situation now is not as sharply critical as then, but it's critical nonetheless. But whether it's the G20 as a forum or other similar fora, we lack that edge. We lack that political leadership. And we lack the sense of initiative, which says, if you take Kathy's presentation, the diagnostic is there, some of the tools are self-apparent. Why aren't we moving? Is a critical question. And in many areas, we require much better coordination than we have at present. And in particular, from an emerging market point of view, it's the emerging markets that post-2009 played a critical role in keeping global growth afloat. But what we see since then is this vacillation and volatility in attitudes towards emerging markets. So a critical factor that I think needs to be dealt with is how do we stabilize the emerging market perceptions and begin to restore confidence in those parts of the world, which will then give us a more stable environment than we have at present.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn to my left to a man who probably knows something of geopolitical risk, and indeed give us a sense of, elaborate on the points that are already being made, but also are you a man who sees the world with the glass half full or indeed half empty, Mr. Simsek?
Thank you. Well, glass appears to be half empty if you look at the market mood, but of course it's never fully so or the other way around. I guess if you take a longer term perspective, aging population is a critical issue, and that calls for low growth on a more sustainable basis, with the exception of maybe Africa and India. I think demographics is going to be increasingly a barrier to high growth that we have experienced over the past 50 years. So for the next 50 years, that's one key factor longer term wise. Secondly, of course, we talked about inequalities earlier on during presentations. I think that's also another critical issue. And unless we find a way around, find a way of addressing this, probably that's going to continue to hinder growth. And that's why I think inclusiveness is such an important theme. During our G20 presidency, we had, as you may remember, we had 3 I's: inclusiveness, investments, and of course, implementation. And I think today we're still at that point that these are very critical, it's a critical framework. Productivity is unlikely to go back to where it was simply because many of the jobs are created in services sector. Services sector are not tradable. So unless we go to a new unless we sign on a global level new generation of free trade agreements where services, public procurement, agriculture is included, so unless we have more trade openness and integration, it may be difficult to go back to the type of productivity growth we experienced, again, over the previous, prior to the Great Recession in 2007. So I think low productivity is probably here to stay for a while. Aging population is a major, major issue. Now, coming back to your question, of course, geopolitics is a big drag, at least in our part of the world. We're now really looking forward to have some form of functioning states in our neighborhoods, because we have a number of countries that actually don't have a functioning state. And that's a source of terror, sort of refugees Europe is fretting over. Another key risk, probably more longer-term risk, is that we have extreme left and extreme right rising in certain parts of the world. And that's also preventing politics from functioning the way it should, meaning in terms of taking courageous decisions, implementing structural reforms that are much needed. So I'm not pessimistic, but I think it would be naive to expect to go back to a pre-Great Recession type of growth, because that's probably to do with leverage that we had at that time. And now going forward, probably, clearly that overhang is also another secular negative. Short term, though, I think risks are more balanced. Probably, a modest improvement in global growth. I agree with OECD projections. It seems likely because Eurozone appears to be at least doing cyclically the right things. And of course, US has a bit of a momentum, and emerging markets, probably have, will recover on the back of some improvement in the sentiment as well as in commodity prices. So glass is probably short term, a little bit more half full, but longer term clearly is half empty. That'll be my take.
Mr. Li Wei, would you have a similarly longer-term pessimism? We are turning to the emerging markets that had previously helped us through from 2007, 2009, as Mr. Gordon mentioned. Are you optimistic or pessimistic long-term?
Okay, excuse me, this is for you. Yeah. 首先呢，我还是要对 OECD。
Well, first of all, I would like to. Perhaps I'll just pause briefly.
Chinese.
English interpretation. English interpretation on channel 1. First and foremost, I would like to commend the Global Perspectives on its high quality of reporting. And we will include our research in your research body, and we will continue to look into your research. So you mentioned emerging economies, and first I would like to say just a few words. So if we look in the long term, I would say I'm optimistic. However, if we look at the short term, I believe that currently there are some good signs. So there are some positive signs in economic development. But I think that overall, the global economy, or at least in the short term, I'm not sure that it's still a question whether we can enter healthy development. But overall, I think it will enter a stage of healthy development. I'm quite optimistic. However, at the same time, we have a lot of negative aspects of economic development. But this doesn't mean that in the future the economy will be in a recession. I don't think it will be in a recession, so I'm not going to be pessimistic. What about some of the recent economic development trends? I have two things I would like to say about this. The first, I believe that the global economy is still in a post-crisis state. It's still in a state of recovery. That's the first thing I would like to say. Second, I believe that the major economies in the world today are still in a difficult time of economic transition, economic adjustment. The global economy, and I think it has two major states. So first of all, it's recovery, and second, structural adjustment. So of course, there's another trend, which is the diversification of these economies. The localization of economies. But I think in the long term, I am quite optimistic. Especially in the modern world, I think there are some very good signs of economic development. So even though on the political level, we sometimes have limitations as to our impact, but I think that mostly we have a very positive evaluation of the economic development. So what are some of these trends? Since the 80s, we have witnessed increasing globalization. There has been increasing integration among global economies, among different countries. Increased integration, this is one major trend. The second major trend, the professionals in the world, the people in the world, there's increased mobility. So increased mobility for people. And the third is internet technology. I believe that internet technology will be a driver of increasing productivity. And this also concerns national security, the safety of security, property security, and so forth. So I think that today there are some things that we still need to work out in terms of our systems, our structures, and our preparation for the future. So I think that there are these three positive trends, and I believe that they have opened up very good perspectives for the future. But even I do have some believe that we need to continue our research and we need to continue to implement policy. So I think these are some issues related to the Chinese economy, and if you are interested, I will be happy to explain them in greater detail. Thank you very much.
I'm very pleased to see that we have the optimist sat next to the pessimist in the longer term, because we want a little bit of debate and a little bit of disagreement. I'm going to turn to my right now, and Mr. Furman, interesting thoughts there being brought up about productivity and of course the aging population being brought up by Mr. Simsek and also by Mr. Lee there, talking about perhaps whether we are indeed seeing increasing integration or indeed not. Give us my sense. Are you an optimist? Are you a pessimist? And what can you start to respond to some of the comments that you're hearing on this panel already?
So I think my biggest worry is that we're in a middle growth trap that's not an economic phenomenon, but a political phenomenon. President Obama's first chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste," and did a huge amount at a time of economic crisis. We're way past the crisis now. We're growing at 3%. That's okay. That's a lot better than where we were a few years ago, but it still isn't nearly good enough. And we have a strange situation right now, which is the relationship between the politicians and the economic advice. You normally think of it as the politicians are the people that want everything, think there's no trade-offs, sort of go into the candy store, buy more than they can afford, and ignore the fact that it's eventually going to result in cavities. And then you need some sort of nerdy, annoying economists or nerdy, annoying economics organizations like the OECD to come along and point out to them the budget constraints or point out to them the cavities. Right now we have something that's almost precisely the opposite of that. You have the OECD telling us that if we expand investment in infrastructure, not only will we get more growth, but it will actually reduce our debt as a share of GDP. That's a finding that the IMF has also made. And you have policymakers who aren't following that advice and aren't doing, for some reason, aren't going in to the candy store and doing what they're being told to do and investing in infrastructure. So it's a strange reversal, and you see that on a lot of the research and advice about steps you can take that are complementary in terms of expanding productivity and reducing inequality. So we're in this place where we're not doing as well as we should be doing. The good news is there's a lot we can do to do better. A lot of it is in the no regrets types of policies that don't necessarily entail these trade-offs, because we're not at the frontier of where we should be, a frontier where at some point you do get those trade-offs. The bad news is that the 3% growth rate isn't sufficiently motivating for many to get there. I think there's some reason for hope. There's one aspect of the OECD's economic outlook that is now completely, unfortunately, outdated, which is international organizations have been criticized for never predicting a recession. Well, this economic outlook actually predicted that Japan would have a recession in 2017. They predicted 2 quarters in a row of negative growth for Japan. And I think in a step aimed to preempt the economic outlook, Prime Minister Abe, an hour before the outlook was released, announced that he was delaying the consumption tax hike that presumably was causing that technical recession. So I think that was an example of, a very welcome example of taking a step to not do affirmative harm to the economy, to let the recovery continue. But there's a lot more all of us can do to affirmatively expand growth and reduce inequality.
Thank you, Mr. Furman. Mrs. Pluman, optimist, pessimist, and are we starting to see the policies that are needed that the OECD is hinting at? Are we taking the infrastructure plunges that are necessary?
I'm an optimist by default, and the economic outlook is not changing any of that. And optimism is my default position because I think in order to be able to deliver the changes and the new policies that we need to address the risks, we need optimism. We need the energy that optimism recreates. Now, I'm in the business of trade, and trade has been seen as one of the drivers of growth. And we just heard from Angel Gurria that also trade is not delivering, and I think all of us are seeing it. Trade is not delivering because trade is not sustainable enough. So I do think that free trade as we know it needs a reset. It needs to deliver to all. It needs to help us address issues of inequality in our own countries, but also on a global level. A very telling example is Africa produces 75% of the global cocoa, 75%. Although only 2% of the market revenue goes or stays in Africa. Now, I mean, what better case can I make that trade needs a reset, it needs to be more inclusive, and we need to review the way, I would suggest, that we organize our conversation on trade. We're stuck in the WTO. We do free trade agreements on a regional basis. They are not delivering as well as we should. So we need to, I would suggest, reach out at a political level, but also to the private sector. Trade needs to force them to become more sustainable and more inclusive. A living wage is something that is not usual in lots of countries. If you think of that, that's really a reason to be very, very depressed. We're not delivering to the people who we should deliver to, but we can. And as many in the panel said, it's not that complicated. We can do it. The OECD is working with us, is providing us the data, but we need to open up and we need to address inequality. When I was young, addressing inequality was a very political point of view. If you say, inequality is bad, you would be a loony left, no? Which I think is a good place to be. But now the IMF, the World Economic Forum, the Economist, hardly a leftist newspaper, all of those address inequality as the biggest of our problems. Now, that's the task ahead of us. We need to address inequality. Trade and investment can help, but it needs a reset.
Give me a policy to help more than 2% of the revenue go to Africa for cocoa.
Well, I mean, on a policy level and on an abstract level, it's not that complicated. I mean, Ghana produces lots of cocoa. Young people don't want to be a cocoa farmer anymore because it's a traditional thing to do that their grandparents did. You don't earn money with it. You don't add value. Now, if we are able to work with Ghanaian farmers to help them increase productivity, to supply them with the innovations that we have at hand, they can generate growth in their own country. They can generate jobs in their own country, and that will be a good thing, not only for Ghana, but for all of our young people.
Can we start, I think that's a wonderful way to start discussing the actual policies that we need to start to enact. The imagination that Mr. Goran hinted at, wanted to start seeing. Can you give us some imagination, Mr. Valdez, as to what Chile feels needs to be made? I know that many feel constrained by the geopolitics and the politics within their own countries, but what needs to start happening at a country level and then a more broad world level in terms of policy?
Well, let me start by a basic fact. I think we have both structural problems and cyclical problems. So you need to tackle both at the end. There's a lot of discussions among economists, usually, whether it's cyclical or structural. This time, probably everybody agrees that we have both. Although cyclically, we're getting better. If you look at page 17, figure 1.5 in the report from Kathy, you will see that actually labor markets are healing, wages are starting to increase. So the risk is that we get into a low growth trap forever because structurally we don't make a lot of progress. So I think we need more structural policies. What it's very clear is that the responsiveness of countries to structural reform is low. Political traps here are complex, but I think that's very important. And it will help the short run too. If it's credible that we're making progress structurally, that is good for business, that's good for investment. Let me go a bit contrarian now on fiscal. Because fiscal has become a sort of, from many international institutions, as a big saver for the short run. Even Jason mentioned that you could even have a free lunch here. You can do infrastructure and debt to GDP ratios will drop. I'm not sure that's correct. The one thing that I want to point is that this type of advice needs much more details. And let me give you one example. How would this advice will be read in Greece or in Germany? Most likely, you will have a reaction in Greece and not in Germany. And probably the space there is very, very different. So I think we need to tackle much more carefully the policy space each country has and what each country has done so far. Not only the space, how much has been the effort. And we see around countries that have done a lot on this front, and they have current account deficits that are relatively large. So for those, probably you don't need much more. I'm afraid that with the broad brush type of advice, we could endanger at the end some imbalances that we had in the past that are pretty easy to get. So bottom line, I think there's a case for fiscal, not everywhere. It's not easy to have good projects off the shelf. There's no, it's not, once you say infrastructure, yeah, do infrastructure, but the details on this, the governance of infrastructure, for example, are very important for this to work. Second thing, and this goes more broadly for the case of working together. It's true that monetary policy has delivered as much as possible. It's time a bit more for fiscal. But be careful with early withdrawals of monetary policy support. When I mentioned before policy mistakes, I think we have seen around the world early withdrawals of monetary policy support.
Is the US withdrawing too early?
That's a tough one. I think they have been patient enough, and I think they will likely continue to be patient enough. But in the past, in other countries, we have seen interruptions of the monetary policy support that being a bit too early for
Is June or July too early?
I mean, for 25 basis points, I don't mind too much. I think it's much more important than next year and how they phrase this and what they communicate. I think there was a big advance for the world economy that the US started to look at the world economy now, conditions outside the US, explicitly in their communications and their decision-making of what to do.
Mr. Furman, we must get the US response, and also notably to your free lunch as well. Should not every country be hearing the free lunch scenario as others might?
So I think Rodrigo and I probably agree more than we disagree, but out of respect, Caroline, for your desire to have some debate, I'll phrase my agreement on the disagreeable manner.
Good of you.
I think there's obviously the advice differs from country to country, and it's a little bit unfortunate that the countries that have the most fiscal space are the ones that often appear the least interested in using that space, and possibly the opposite as well. I think, though, if you look at most everyone is below their trend growth, most everyone is below their inflation target, most everyone is over-relying on monetary policy. There's an important link between the cyclical and the structural, which is that most everywhere investment growth has been very weak. That's been caused by the demand side, but it manifests itself in the fact that productivity growth is slower almost everywhere than it had been. That you take all of that together, and I think the danger far more tilts towards people not taking the fiscal advice seriously than the wrong people taking it. I think there are both dangers, there are both types of countries, but the preponderance is in one direction. I also think this free lunch result goes again a little bit against all of our instincts and training in economics or as finance ministers and responsibility, but it actually is a pretty robust result that's been found by a couple different models in a couple different contexts. If you take a look, for example, at the Federal Reserve's model, FERBIS, one of the best structural macroeconomic models, it wasn't rigged to answer this question. But if you put into that model, the United States invests more in infrastructure, and then you ask that model what happens to the debt to GDP ratio, it says it goes down. And that just happens to be the artifact of what was already in that model. So I think we shouldn't be too shy about taking seriously the results that a range of models and research are telling us. I think right now, on balance, we're being too shy, even if there's some places that are going too far.
Mr. Gordon, are we getting imaginative enough for you? I want you to leave this panel feeling that we've come up with some new policies or thought outside the box, as many concern in these sorts of debates that actually we talk about what has already been discussed. Can we spend our way out? Could there be an element that you invest in infrastructure and that will help the debt go down? Is that what you need to deploy?
Yeah, no, I haven't been to the candy store.
No cavities.
That's the first confession. No, I suppose fiscal cautiousness is something that we've got to build into the way in which finance ministers work. And if the temptation is there to go spend too long in the candy store, the ratings agencies are around to remind us that you spent a bit too long, get out of there. And that balance is both useful and sometimes not so useful, because it can become quite constricting. Are
you feeling too constricted at the moment? We understand, of course,
that
a few days.
As a country, we're going through a bit of a difficult patch, but I think we've been making the right moves at the right times and staying at the doorstep of the candy store, not quite getting in, and making sure we can retreat timeously as well.
Are you confident that, therefore, you will not go into junk?
Well, we in a day's time, we'll know what Standard & Poor's is going to say, but we're fairly confident for now. But I think the more important question, whilst there's these ifs and buts, as policymakers, citizens expect answers from us. Citizens expect that we will come up with actions that will relieve pressure, that will address the question of, for example, youth employment, training for youth so that they have a better future. And both in the advanced economies and elsewhere, from the numbers we saw earlier on, that's a significant challenge that we have as we go forward. Secondly, the issue of coordination. Rodrigo's right. I mean, as recently as, 2013, we had the taper tantrum when the world wasn't taken into account in the way in which the Fed chairman then made certain comments about withdrawing from QE. And certainly we've moved in a very different direction here. But perhaps one of the things that the OECD could do is to help us as both emerging markets and as developed economies to have some debates and exchanges on the relationship between dominant economies and the policy decisions that they make and the impact that those policy decisions have on emerging markets. There is an interesting shift as far as monetary policy is concerned, but are there other policy areas where dominant economies actually overreach themselves sometimes or don't take sufficient account of what is happening in emerging economies is something to look at. Another area which I think is still an area of concern is volatility in financial flows. If there's a slight move on the side of the Fed, many of the emerging markets are going to see outflows, and that begins to create another set of volatilities as well. We still are concerned on and off, depending on which week we look at, and even sometimes days, about currency wars breaking out, inverted commas. So we haven't gone past that kind of situation where we have sufficient coordination in the globe to ensure that we don't go back to even the threat of currency wars or currency depreciations to enhance one's own export prospects and economic prospects in a particular environment. So I think there's still a set of issues that at a global level we need to resolve. And perhaps the final point is to re-examine the relationship between political and economic elites and citizens, and the way in which inequalities are being exacerbated. So it's good that the issue of inequality and inclusivity is now center stage, but we've still got to come up with better answers than we have at the moment as to what does that mean in practical policy and implementation terms, so that ordinary citizens feel that they're not sitting on the margins of well-being, so to speak, but are actually enjoying the benefits of that.
Well put, and let's ask Mr. Lee now. I'm aware that we are falling short on time, which is always the way, but give me a sense of what China is enacting to tackle inequalities, inclusivity, but also aware of what we're hearing about the volatility, how you're being impacted by the larger developed nations and indeed the volatility that China experiences itself.
Please,
Perhaps everyone would like to put on headphones.
Thank you to our
Well, thank you very
moderator.
much for...
I'm here, and after I came to Europe to visit, I met a lot of friends who are...
我想这个各位对中国经济的关注，主要还是来源于三个要素。
Okay, I think there are essentially three elements which need to be taken into account. I was mentioning just now the first, which is the great degree of integration and mutual reliance between nations that exists now. Secondly, we have the fact that China has become the second largest economy with an extremely large GDP. And the third factor is that following some 30 years of reform since the late 70s, we had become accustomed to something close to 10% annual GDP growth, which has now slowed to a lower level. And so, you know, when it comes to whether that is something that will remain the case for the foreseeable future, of course, everyone is very interested to see what happens. When it comes to the policy decisions that can be made and to forward-looking analysis, there is, of course, the accommodating monetary policy issue, which comes to the fore. The head of the World Bank has looked into these issues, and we have reports which address some of the questions raised. But we feel that among the factors involved, the first most important one is that by 2020, we expect that we will be able to keep an annual growth rate of approximately 6 to 7% per year. And so essentially, we feel that this is a realistic way of looking at developments for the next few years. Despite the difficulties involved, we feel that it is something that can be done. And when it comes to 2030, we feel that we could quite possibly be able to maintain something like 5.5% annual GDP growth as a cruising speed. And of course, it's harder to say what happens at a further date like that. The second point I would make is that if we look at the way that the economy is performing, there are a number of characteristics. First of all, a certain amount of predictability, a certain amount of progressive adaptation, an ability to control economic developments. And I will return to each of these in turn. So first of all, when it comes to the sort of rules that can be identified in the way that the economy develops over time, we've seen enormous amounts of investment in the economy, and according to economic rules, there should be inevitably a certain amount of downward adjustment in these levels of investment over time. The second characteristic, that of gradual change, if we look at the very gradual way in which economic growth has been slowing down, I think this appears quite clearly. And if we compare the way that this has taken place historically at similar stages of development in other countries, our speed of slowing down is somewhat slower, with, for example, 7.3, 7.4, respectively, in 2014 and 2015, a relatively gradual pace of the reduction in the pace of economic growth. So that I do not think that we need to be overly concerned about these things. Of course, we're fully aware of the risks and hazards that exist, but we're not overly worried. And if you look at a growth rate of approximately 7%, bearing in mind the overall weight of China, in fact, the corresponding figure, if you will, would be the total GDP of a country that might be ranked somewhere between 20 and 24th in the world. And so we're talking about approximately 160 billion US dollars. We are seeing that this is something which I think illustrates a very progressive, gradual, moderate rate of slowdown, and therefore something that should not be a cause for excessive concern. The third characteristic that I was referring to is the ability to keep a hand on economic developments, and we feel that it would be possible, of course, to achieve some further adjustments in, for example, the level of investment or growth in the economy. We understand that in terms of investment, there is, of course, the potential there for further investment. The financial resources would be there. But the pace of economic growth should not be too high, nor should it be too low, which would, similarly be a cause for worry. And the fourth characteristic I would mention is an important one, and that is the inclusive character of our growth, the possibility to reach a stage of maturity where a lot of internal factors come into play in contributing to economic growth. There are many different contradictory forces at work in the way that the economy is developing. But if we look at the overall stage of development at which we are, I think that we are clearly at a very important point. We are seeing the rate of increase in people's revenues increasing faster on average than the rate of GDP growth. And so this is something which concerns also the difference between the city and rural growth rates. 6.7 in the city, 8.7 in the countryside. And we are also seeing an overall drop in unemployment, which is at about 5.1%. Every year, we are seeing job creation reaching approximately 1.3 billion jobs. And this, of course, is something which contributes to the lively development of the Chinese economy. If we look at the rates of growth in the revenue in the city and the countryside that I was mentioning just now, if this is something that we can maintain over time, I think it's safe to say that everyone should be pretty optimistic about the fact that China's economy, despite the many difficulties and challenges that we are going to be faced with, will be able to continue to develop a pace in a very stable manner. Thank you.
From the optimist to someone who said he was a pessimist, Mr. Simsek, do you believe that we are indeed seeing the right pace of slowdown in the emerging markets, are seeing the right pace of inclusivity in the emerging markets?
Well, emerging markets were obviously quite favored over the past decade or so, but in recent years, of course, there's been significant headwinds. I would say that emerging markets are a lot more resilient, so let's not forget that. Secondly, I think demographics still argues that emerging markets would do better in the long run. Most emerging markets are in the catching up phase, and hopefully these recent pressures, the recent fallout from low commodity prices and market volatility associated with capital flows will encourage them to do more reforms. I think we're already seeing evidence of more reforms in emerging markets in terms of diversification in countries that are heavily reliant on commodities. So I'm actually, I would argue that probably emerging markets, have seen quite a bit of a downside already, and going forward, we should hopefully see them with the help of structural reforms and relatively flexible sort of policies that emerging markets will start to sort of recover. But I guess, again, if you look at the markets, clearly after a decade of a strong run, markets are more pessimistic here than probably you would be just looking at very basic fundamentals. Just one short comment on the previous debate. I think it's not just how much you spend, but where you spend it. So on the fiscal policy, I think there's a lot of room, clearly. And sometimes it's hard to understand countries that are able to tap capital markets, at almost negative rates or close to zero rates. Why they're not bringing forward investments in human capital, in training, in infrastructure. It's very puzzling. It's very hard to understand, and there are many countries out there. That's key. I think the focus on structural reforms is an appropriate one. But let's face it, when times are difficult, political ownership tends to be weaker, even though I think there is low-hanging fruit. For example, nobody would see any political fallout if you were to try to improve investment climate, if you were to try to provide more support for SMEs, or if you were to provide more incentives for women entrepreneurs or female labor participation. So there is low-hanging fruit. There's a lot that can be done, but much of it is more medium, long-term. The issue is short-term. I think we have to rely more on fiscal because monetary policy has largely been exhausted. And I would argue that probably these negative interest rates sometimes provide more confusion than help. And there's an argument that even bank profitability suffer and lending suffers on the back of that, or there's a negative confidence effect. But, I think everybody probably would agree that monetary policy has run its course to a large extent. And the fiscal policy has to step in with the structural reforms clearly complementing it. And on the fiscal policy side, again, as I said, that there is huge scope for reorientation of existing spending, but that requires political will. But some spending by those who can afford, and real rates are so much below headline growth rates that actually there is a justification and there is support for the OECD findings. One final statement is that many of emerging markets have inadequate infrastructure. And I think the multiplier there, the fiscal multiplier from investing in infrastructure is very, very strong. So I think emerging markets also should prioritize infrastructure spending, and in Turkey we are doing that. We have prioritized human capital, physical infrastructure, and R&D. Thank you.
We must now draw this to a close, so I will give Ms. Pluman the final say that it's time for developed nations, those with negative rates in particular, so we're thinking Japan, we're thinking Germany, we're thinking, and particularly many in Europe, to start spending. Is that the policy?
I would suggest that my own country is in a relatively good shape when you look at it at a macro level, although also with us, unemployment rates are too high. And we've been reforming, clearly, the economy, which was really necessary, but we've also been investing in education, for example. And I think investment in education is one of the best investments that you can do. On a global scale, you could say that the global goals that we've decided upon in September are the best agenda for a demand-driven investment than we had in the last decades. And just two more remarks. One on the low-hanging fruit. There is low-hanging fruit, following up on my colleague, Vice Prime Minister Cimcek. There is research that shows if women in rural areas have the same access to productive means in agriculture, the agricultural production will go up by 17%. Just giving them access to the same means, giving them a voice, giving them land rights, and making innovation available to them. 17%, low-hanging fruit. I mean, what more do you need? The other structure, and the structural reform that has not been discussed here, where the OECD has done some tremendous work, and where also my own country has been pushing for very much, also as EU president, and it should be mentioned on this panel, is of course tax. The best structural reform is a fair tax system on a global and a national scale. Pay your taxes where you make your profits. Don't only tax consumers, but come up with a fair tax system that will give you all the policy space that you need. And research of the London School of Economics even shows that if there is an equal and a fair tax base, it's really true, London School of Economics. I mean, people will be more happier. Happier people are more productive. More productive people will make for a more equal society. It's not that complicated. Just do it.
Innately optimistic. We end on that optimistic note. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a wonderful set of panelists. Thank you very much for all your viewpoints. Please do give it up. There was, of course, Lilian Pluman, Minister of Foreign Trade and Development for the Netherlands, sat next to Li Wei, of course, President of the DRC in China. We have then to my left, of course, we had Mehmet Cimcek, apologies for my poor pronunciation, Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey. Then, of course, thank you very much indeed. We have Rodrigo Valdez, speaking very eloquently from Minister of Finance of Chile. Then Jason Furman, President of the Council of Economic Advisors in the US. And lastly, of course, with South Africa, Pravin Gordhan, the Minister of Finance. Please, a huge thank you to all those in the audience as well.